Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. When Israeli civilian and military leaders consider their strategic vista, they must see the forest rather than the trees. It is easy to focus or even fixate on the problem of the day instead of clinging to the coherent context and deriving the details from it. So what are the most important challenges in Israel's inbox, and are they synonymous with the Jewish nation's most pressing ones? Or is there a difference between the immediate and the long-term obstacles clouding Israel's future? To help us unpack it, we're joined here by Brigadier General in Reserve Yossi Kuperwasser, formerly the Director General of the Israeli Ministry for Strategic Affairs, the head of the IDF Intelligence Directorate's Research and Assessment Unit, as well as currently the President-designate of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, General.
Thank you for having me.
Indeed. Also joining us here is no other than Dr. Arad, formerly the National Security Advisor, Director of the National Security Council here in Jerusalem, as well as a former Division Chief of Mossad. It's a pleasure to have you with us as well, sir. And last but not least, Mr. Amir Oren, TV7's Editor-at-Large. Mr. Oren, set the stage for us.
Last but in charge of the list of problems that Israel has. And there's an underlying assumption in your question, as if one can come up with the national concept that most of Israelis can agree to, and then set the priorities regarding the various components of this concept. This is almost impossible because scholars and staffers may come up with some list according to priorities, but politicians and perhaps the electorate can come up with another. And it's usually the meeting of the minds between the various groups, which is why I'm deflecting the question to our distinguished panelists.
Well, let's start with Dr. Arad and focus on the grand challenge of the state of Israel, which may not be a mathematical equation, but it has a specific answer. And therefore, when we're looking from a broad scheme of things, is the Islamic Republic of Iran still Israel's top adversary, enemy, and what is, within that context, the chief focus that we need to raise today?
First, I want to hedge by saying one should not always seek to see what is number one, because there is a price to be paid for this, the idea of prioritization. There is a saying by Peter Drucker who once said that the effective manager does first things first and second things not at all. So when you select number one, inadvertently, you are dooming the number 2 or 3 to relative neglect. So I do not want to say which is 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'll just list 3 or 4, which are all interrelated. Israel is now still in the midst of a very serious crisis, which is national. National in the sense that it has a domestic dimension and a foreign dimension. And it has problems both, and again, they're interrelated. The challenges that it has now, when it has to rise and confront the product of the current crisis, is while taking also account that the world around it is also circling and dangers come from other sides, which also project into Israel's agenda. But the challenges are 4. Iran certainly is the one among the 2 that are the most serious ones, because in a general way, Iran is now a combatant. For the first time, we have fought. They've attacked us directly with those ballistic missiles. Now it's not a game of hide and seek. We have also said that we will not allow Iran to become nuclear, hinting that we might use force. So, evidently, strategically, in any kind of a sense, Iran is a major rival with whom we have strategic and military friction, and then it takes the form of its activities like the proxies it had, won or lost. But Iran is center stage. The second one, which is not lesser in significance, is the Palestinian. You cannot escape from the Palestinian. The Palestinian is, unlike the Iranian issue, the Palestinian is a product of our being here. And it also always takes the form, often, while there may be periods of lulls and even negotiations, the use of violence by Palestinians has been used continuously by small groups, by large groups, on a large-scale uprising, or the Hamas attack, which in all practical purposes is a semi-military attack. It's terrorist in the sense that it targets civilians, but in its formation, it's a military entanglement. And we have to look at the complex of the Palestinian issue. And there, I think that Israel's strategic challenge is essentially to neutralize the possibility of this costing any kind of violence and gradually come to the point in which that conflict is not resolved completely politically, but violence is ruled out, even in the form of terrorism of one kind or another. But then we have two internal challenges upon which the first two depend, because you wouldn't be able to mount. One has to do with the domestic constitutional crisis that we've had in what was called the, so to speak, the judicial revolution, which tried to move too fast, too aggressively, benefiting by the majority that the coalition has, into changing much of Israel's governmental structure. But all this has come at the cost of loss in governance, and in some degree, you agree that the executive branch is less competent, sometimes less able to assume its responsibilities in managing and governing Israel's from north to south. So we have a major problem of restoration or regaining that competence, and it calls for a resolution of this judicial constitutional issue. The second one is, which is a grand challenge, is because of this being a technological age, because of Israel's traditional balance in which its technological advancement used to offset our inferiority in numbers. We have a strong dependence on the educational system, on the research capability, on our scientific and technological capabilities, because they are the backbone of also what we accomplish militarily or economically. And there, these are very large systems in Israel. It calls for a major reform. Now, all these are grand challenges because they are simply enormous in scope, and they need the kind of leadership which is able to execute them. The problem is one of execution, not of declaration.
Indeed. Well, with regard to reforming or reformation of any sort, my mother, who I regard as a very wise woman, always says, it's not what you do, it's how you do it.
Yes.
And that is the process to which you ultimately are able to acquire as much as possible consensus of implementation. But in the long trajectory, and when we're talking about the various prioritizations that we're talking about, be it the education system that didn't see a significant budget as was in the mid-90s for too long now, and therefore we do see the consequences thereof within Israel's education system. We can also learn from other countries what they do and how they do it. And I always say Finland is a good example of a proper education. Of course, the matter in substance is not necessarily the matter in method, which is
we could learn
not one
from
and
many.
the same.
The
Indeed.
best performing, by the way, is Singapore, Switzerland. They are doing well.
Absolutely. Well, General Kuperwasser, we cannot stress enough that Israel has many priorities and needs to deal with many issues. I agree with Dr. Arad. One is not necessarily more important than the other, and Ultimately, they have significant implications on the national security interests of the State of Israel. But nonetheless, there is resource allocation, and the resources are limited. And therefore, how do we consider the distribution of those resources at a time, for instance, when we're talking about the longest landmass border of the State of Israel, eastern part of the State of Israel, namely Jordan? There is now a significant project in trying to establish specific defensive hurdles in order to potentially, for a future case scenario, be confronted by some sort of threat from the east. Are those type of long-term projects preceding the necessities of today?
Not proceeding. It's we have to deal with everything simultaneously. That's the problem. That we have so many challenges at the same time, and we have to give an answer to each challenge. We cannot neglect any. We made a terrible mistake by believing that Iran is the big problem and Hezbollah is the big problem, and ignoring the threat from Hamas, and we are still paying a heavy price for that. So we need to find the real challenge of Israel is to find a policy, a strategy that would leverage and take advantage of everything that we have accomplished during the last 15 months in order to shape a new Middle East, a new architecture for the Middle East. That takes care of all the elements that comprise the picture. And we managed to prove how dangerous and how vulnerable is Iran. And we managed to weaken Iran considerably and create the conditions for a collapse of the Assad regime. And Hezbollah is a different Hezbollah than the one we used to know for many years. And Hamas is a different Hamas than the one we knew for many years. And we have to leverage all of that together with the fact that there's a different administration now in the United States that looks at the situation in a much closer way to the one we look at it. And this creates an opportunity to promote the idea of normalization between us and the Saudis and change the landscape in the Middle East even more. And the question is, how do you do it? Because there are prices to pay in order to make it happen.
Right.
And how this idea that we can have a free lunch was always on our mind. But eventually we can't have a free lunch, but we still want to pay the least we can in order to make it happen. One of the reasons we want to pay the least is because we don't have a lot of money. That's, all the problems that Uzi mentioned are costing us. We have all kinds of domestic problems, tensions on top of the two that he mentioned. I would add the question of the Haredis conscription, and it's another topic that is weakening Israel from the inside. So how do you manage all of these challenges simultaneously? I think that two things, you have to find the focal point that may have the most impact on the situation. And these are two. One, weakening Hamas in Gaza, because this was what the war was all about. What is going to happen in Gaza? We have to weaken Hamas in Gaza. And that's why it's so important that we get the green light from Washington for removing Hamas from power in Gaza after we finish the deal with for the hostages. And secondly, weakening Iran. That's depriving Iran from the capability to produce nuclear weapons. These are the two focal points that would allow us to go further along the path of normalization with the Saudis, designing a new situation in the north with everything that happened in Lebanon and in Syria, and in a way that would guarantee our security for the long term. That is what's most important right now. How do you do that while maintaining stability inside Israel? It's not easy because we see the tensions that threaten the stability, especially of the government, but maybe even beyond that. It's a masterpiece to be designed by the leadership, and as Uzi said correctly, it's a matter of leadership to make this all happen.
May I weigh in on something that you, Jonathan,
Briefly,
and you, Yossi, said regarding what you said about there's no free lunch? It's like the old story. The good news is that yes, there is a free lunch. The bad news, you must have it on Yom Kippur when you must fast. Now, you said you quoted your wise mother regarding and it's not the what, it's the how, but it's also the who. And if you look at the Middle East over the last 16 months or so, look at how many people have gone from the scene, starting with Yahya Sinwar, Nasrallah, and all of the rest of the Hamas leaders, Biden, obviously several Israeli top people, Defense Minister Gallant, Chief of Staff Halevi is on his way out, and personalities matter. So perhaps our discussion here will get a certain color one day, but over time may change completely.
That is true. We're talking now about particularly...
And Assad. I forgot Assad.
Assad, of course,
One
has been...
staying in power is Netanyahu.
Right. Well, if we're talking now about another concrete challenge that we're talking often and discussing often is the Northern Front, particularly since Hezbollah has been brought to its knees, having Naim Qassem, another personality who is set to bury both of his predecessors. But
and not much of a personality from what we know.
And a very weak personality at that. Nonetheless, this vacuum that emerged in Syria has brought about a fluid situation. Many countries are trying to consider Ahmed al-Shara or Abu Habab al-Julani as someone of that should be taken note of and that he's going to consolidate power, but he's not consolidated power yet. He's very weak, and it seems like the fluidity of the situation there might bring about a reality. Hopefully he won't perpetrate or continue to perpetrate the atrocities that Shishikli back in the 50s did, but ultimately Shishikli, who fled later to Brazil, was also eliminated there by the Druze who followed him there and made sure that everybody knew it was the Druze for the atrocities he committed. So the fluidity of the situation, going from the Alawites to the Druze to the Kurds to even a large part of Jaish al-Hur, the military of the Free Syrian military, who do not accept him despite being Sunni Muslims, including in Daraa. So we're looking at a very broad scheme of things that will challenge Israel on the Northern Front. Briefly, if we're looking at this issue, is Israel in a position to have a seat at the table in negotiations with the Americans, with the Turks, with the Saudis potentially in this context?
Indirectly. It won't be invited to the official table, but behind the scenes, yes. But regarding what Yossi said earlier about our failure having looked at Iran and Hezbollah, and therefore at least relatively neglecting Hamas, Israel can, through risk management, put Syria or the Syrian front at the bottom of its drawer right now. Of course, it can't ignore it completely, but it has more pressing challenges.
Dr. Arad, Mr. Oren just mentioned, behind the scenes, yes, but obviously in the public sphere, the public eye, not. Why? Why shouldn't we come out and say we are a neighboring country with national security interests and we deserve a seat at the table, not only for our supremacy on the military specter, or the QME, the qualitative military edge, but also from a relative aspect where the Turks have security guarantees in Syria, Iraqis are demanding security guarantees, Lebanon are fearful for their own existence because of the Syrian file. Why not come forward and say, we are here to stay and we demand A, B, C, D?
Well, we could do that and we should do that. And also the style of, it's not diplomacy, the style of international engagement today is much different than that pursued in the previous decade. And there is much greater flexibility into the procedures. You don't have to do everything necessarily through secrecy. Sometimes you can do it above board. You see, to engage in all those, Israel should have, and this is a challenge, a policy of much greater Arab engagement. The essence of the Abraham Accord and what is now pursued with others, and so forth, essentially is a change in the volume and intensity of engagement we have with Arab countries, which in the past we didn't have. There were a few discrete channels and they were like bottlenecks. Now you have it on a wide range when you have economic business people. The secret people come and appear on television as if, it's open. So you can have much greater flexibility, and I'm not excluding talking to everybody. People do not know, the Israelis have a notion that enemies you don't talk to, which indeed we never had any direct, took time until we met enemies and negotiated with them. Sometimes we had discrete channels. They don't know, for example, that even at the height of the Cold War, even in moments in which the two sides went to the brink, they still had embassies and they talked. They present, they met constantly. Now, the idea of meeting with one another would be facilitated if there would be an extension of multilateral diplomacy. The more you have such clubs to which you're invited by virtue of your belonging, when Shimon Peres once said he wants to be a member of the Arab League, I thought this was a lapsus on his part. No, he meant it possibly as an observer, which comes to mind, yes, they are to the League observers. So it would be very beneficial if all these activities, which, like the 6 ministers who met now in Cairo, I think, and issued a new position, which would update the Arab League and the Saudi proposal of the time into a new approach taken by them as a group. They were now a group. Why shouldn't we be there than in other groupings? Now, all this discussion of the possibility of multilateral activity, which would be much more in the open, which would have much greater, now is being adversely affected by Trump inclination to withdraw from international commitments, to withdraw from international organizations, got out of the...
Not necessarily withdraw, but reform them.
Well, but no, he stepped out of the World Health Organization.
Right.
Everybody, so he is a unilateralist, or, he's a self-promoter in so many ways. But essentially, that should not hinder the idea that we should be engaging everybody, and I'm not excluding Iran. Why on earth? It is, even when we threaten to preempt and attack them if they will pursue nuclear weapons, this does not mean that we can talk to them. America and Russia talk to one another.
A good example when we're talking about the Iranians is the Turks. The most bitter rivals are Turkey and Iran, and ultimately, when they talk together, they have great smiles, but behind the scenes, we all know how bitter rivals they are from Iraq to Syria and elsewhere. But General Kuperwasser, we don't have very much time left, and when we're talking about Israeli priorities and security concerns, one of them is not necessarily related to Israel directly, but rather the stability of neighboring regimes, be they the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, or even the government currently of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, because if those two countries fall into disarray, the implications for Israel are vast.
Well, definitely, but I think that though there are new threats to their stability with the success of Turkey in taking over or being involved in the taking over of Syria by forces that are closely related to Turkey, I think that overall the situation of stability in Egypt and Jordan is better now than it used to be before, when the Iranians had this axis of evil operating all over the place and trying to destabilize Jordan, maybe later on Egypt. So it's a better situation for them. And I think that talking about seat at the table for Israel in those discussions about the fate of Syria, I think this is a virtual table. It doesn't have to be a real table. And we do have a seat on this virtual table. We have a seat in the virtual table of the Arab League, and we have a seat in the virtual table that deals with the fate of Syria, because we have assets, we have new assets, we have proven our capabilities everybody understands that with the new policies of Israel, they have to take Israel into account. The fact that Israel now has a much greater readiness to take action in all these arenas and affect the way these arenas develop is something that is giving us the ticket to participate in shaping the new situation in the Middle East. And the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu was the first regional leader that was asked to come and visit President Trump is another thing that proves that Israel has a capability to impress on the situation in all these places, and we should take advantage of this. And this is the most important thing, that we have to know how to do that. It's not easy because we can make mistakes. We have a history of mistakes, and we have to learn from these mistakes and make sure that we do it properly, respecting the concerns of the others, at the same time standing on our back feet, protecting our real security interests.
You know, during the heyday, what seemed like the heyday of Israel before the Yom Kippur War, Ariel Sharon was quoted as saying, yes, the Arabs have the oil, but we have the matchbox. And by the same token, if we are not at the table, we may cut the table to pieces. But there is one challenge we haven't talked about regarding Israel, and that is technology. If we do not know how to harness AI, lasers, and other advances, and our adversaries are in the race, and our advantage will not be the same way it was earlier, we're in trouble.
Indeed. With that being said, certain unveilings that were made just recently by the Chinese and others about the AI ultimately were indicative of some hollow expectations rather than reality on the ground. With regard to your comment, as long as we don't do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, I think we should be okay. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Arad, General Kuperwasser, and Mr. Oren for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.